So good evening, everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. But before I do, I just want to build on Michael's land acknowledgement. We're Canadians, we love to acknowledge land in cultural institutions. So mine will maybe query a little bit about that tradition. We're meeting here today, as Michael mentioned, on the Anishinaabe traditional lands in the territories of William's treaties of 1923. The terms of these treaties were among the worst in Canadian history, comprised of one-time cash payments as low as $25 per person. The Canadian state position for decades was that these payments extinguished all Indigenous land claims on this territory, transferring property rights entirely to the Crown, and prohibiting Indigenous fishing, hunting, and ceremonial activities outside of reservation lands. These terms were only revised in 2018. So land acknowledgements are always a little bit awkward, kind of a performance of gesturing at colonial paths, but also hopes for reconciliation in the future. I share these hopes. But I know that they can at times seem a bit trite if we stick to lines about honoring the spirits of treaties that are fundamentally violent, or honoring the teachings of people that most often aren't in the room. So instead, I'd like to use this opportunity to reflect on the enduring role of land in adjudicating positions of power, violence, and increasingly environmental harm. This is a perspective that for a time has been more difficult than most to integrate into the fields of media and cultural studies, where it seems like predominantly what we were talking about was questions of things on pages or screens, not landscapes or atmospheres. However, this is rapidly changing, thanks in part to the intervention of our speaker tonight, Dr. Lisa Parks. So Lisa is many things, a distinguished professor of film and media studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is the director of Global Media Technologies and Cultures Lab therein, and she's also a MacArthur Fellow among many, many other awards and honors. I personally think of her as one of the foundational and enduringly generative voices in media studies' infrastructural turn. Her 2005 book, Cultures in Orbit, brought feminist STS to the study of satellite television, and with it a plethora of new ways to analyze its politics of territory and embodiment. 2018's Rethinking Media Coverage, Vertical Mediation and the War on Terror similarly taught us to think questions of territory, affect, and control along the Z-axis through the mediations of the skies. She's also the co-editor of many collections that connect wider networks of thinkers on these subjects, and tonight we will have the pleasure of previewing part of her forthcoming book, Mixed Signals, Media Infrastructures on the Outskirts. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Parks.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Victoria and Catherine, for facilitating this visit. And also, thanks to all of you for being here tonight. Santa Barbara is a long way away, and I feel very honored to be here. I also feel honored to be here in a named lecture series for someone who I'm sure contributed a great deal to this institution and to many people's lives here, and it means a lot to be extended this invitation and to be able to join you tonight. It's also kind of really interesting for me to be in Electric City, and I spent the afternoon wandering around the streets, especially right around the GE physical plant, and trying to understand and learn what's happening in that transitional space and what the impacts of the surrounding neighborhoods might be and the economy. And so that's something that I found very interesting today. So what I'd like to do in the lecture this evening is to present Work in Progress, which is the draft of an introduction to my new book that I've been working on for quite some time. And I'm just going to present from manuscript. I'll have quite a few slides to show as well, so you'll get a palpable sense, hopefully, of this project. And then I'd be glad to get feedback or comments, critique, and input at the end of the presentation. The term mixed signals generally refers to a condition in which a communicator sends a message that is somehow contradictory, misleading, or confusing. The receiver typically tries to parse or clarify the message, but often the condition of contradiction persists. Some might say that all communication is ultimately about mixed signals. In this book, I mobilize this generic meaning to evoke a variety of conditions related to the current conjuncture of media globalization. And I realized I was going to show you my research areas first: satellite studies, media militarization and surveillance. These are projects I've worked on in the past, and the work tonight is in this last third area, critical studies of media infrastructure. So going back to what I was saying, first I used the term mixed signals to point to the materialities of modern media as electronics and to focus on technologies of media distribution. Second, I used the term to call attention to the multiple and overlapping satellite footprints, wireless coverage zones, and cloud regions that crisscross and reconstitute the Earth's surface as expansive signal territories. Third, the term is helpful in pointing to the contradictory messages publics receive from states and companies about media systems and services. Increasingly in these messages, public means auctioned, free speech equals capture, participation equals surveillance, services equals traps, and so on and so forth. And fourth, the term mixed signals registers the rich heterogeneity of media content, forms, and formats in circulation, and the possibilities of assembling, combining, and remixing them within affective economies. Finally, mixed signals hints at the productive ambivalences and frictions within scholarly understandings of the terms media, mediation, and media globalization. So the book sets out to engage these issues by investigating media infrastructures in post-war, post-socialist, and post-colonial contexts. In it, I suggest that those who have grown accustomed to ubiquitous high-speed connectivity and media abundance have much to learn about media technologies from those beyond the world's political, economic, and cultural capitals. In case studies presented in this book, people have sorted through the ruins of war to rebuild media after socialist broadcast and telecom systems were bombed from above. They have oscillated between fraying colonial telecom infrastructures and emergent systems of neoliberal platform capitalism. And they've drawn on local resources, knowledge, and labor to create their own links to the global media economy, often after being ignored for decades by state and commercial providers. Because people in the outskirts often inhabit remote areas with smaller populations and limited incomes, they are often overlooked and deemed politically, economically, and technologically insignificant by states and media and telecom companies, and sometimes even by media scholars. As I demonstrate throughout this book, however, people in such communities create media technologies and distribution practices that challenge contemporary mappings of world media systems, disrupt knowledge hierarchies around the technological, confront energy scarcity and other ecological matters, and help to produce and sustain media economies that support local cultures and laborers. This book redirects the study of media globalization away from media capitals and toward the outskirts. The term outskirt refers to, quote, an outer border or fringe, an area on the outer edge, especially of a town, city, or district, end quote. The word can function as a noun, usually pluralized, a verb, or an adjective. The OED traces its use as a noun back to 1633 to characterize the positions of families and areas relative to the state of Ireland. By 1835, the adjective was used to characterize, quote, less civilized outskirt nations, end quote, of the British Empire. The term has since been used to refer to an area that exists beyond, yet around or adjacent to another. Often the term is connotatively associated with disenfranchisement, poverty, neglect, or informality, though not always. By the 1990s, use of the verb to outskirt meant to outmaneuver. Thus, outskirt is a multivalent signifier associated with dynamic acts of border inquiry and boundary making, as well as the imaginaries in politics of borrowing, sharing, reinventing, bypassing, and outdoing. By exploring media distribution on the outskirts, this study builds on scholarly critiques of centralization in media studies. These critiques call out the so-called myth of the mediated center, which Nick Coldry reminds us, quote, is always a construction. Its imaginary spatial form conflicts with the very different form that the media's spatial operations actually take, end quote. Coldry uses the concept of scatter to suggest that media processes can be understood as, quote, a world with many centers that produce and distribute media messages, end quote. Critiques of the media center also recognize the importance of what Cristina Venegas calls, quote, thinking regionally, while at the same time complicating the area studies paradigm, which, as Ray Chow has argued, tends to reify and reinforce the superpowers, world carvings, and organization of the planet into post-World War II, quote, spheres of influence. The question is how to conduct research and write in a way that evokes the relational, unpredictable, and power-laden dynamisms and materialities of media globalization. This cannot be reduced to the study of macro-level international flows or patterns across national contexts, to the tracking of powerful multinational conglomerates, or analysis of cultural policies that many people are either unaware of, exploited by, or refuse to abide by. Though such work is vitally important, there's also a need for more basic research on the everyday conditions in which people in different parts of the world live, work, and think with media technologies. Such research is often carried out by anthropologists and ethnographers who have generated a rich and extensive body of research on uses of media and information technologies in particular cultural contexts. Certainly there are overlaps between research on media in anthropology and film and media studies and cultural studies. But there are differences in training, in critical dispositions, and purpose as well. As a post-structuralist feminist, I was trained to question the foundational assumptions of Western anthropology and reflect upon the power differentials inherent in conducting transcultural research. I learned from feminist post-colonial critics to approach research as processes of unlearning, listening, and critical reflexivity, rather than aspired toward longitudinal immersion or mastery. Because of this, I've tried to formulate understandings of media technologies and globalization that are grounded in partiality rather than embedded in universalizing perspectives and ontological claims. I've adopted a site-specific, idiosyncratic, and relational approach to investigate media infrastructures and globalization, in part because nation-states, companies, and regulators have not shown much evidence that their priority is to support diverse publics. Rather than learn about media infrastructure from the centers of power, then, I try to understand it from an array of particular perspectives. And in this book, I approach the concepts of global media and media globalization as sites of problematization and critical inquiry rather than as givens. I just put up a couple slides here just to show you some of the spaces I've been working in. I'm avoiding showing a lot of people because I don't have everybody's permission to show their faces who I've interviewed and contacted. But I'm inspired by the work of feminist theorists Inderpal Grewal and Karen Kaplan, who in their Pathbreaking collection, it was a while ago, a couple decades ago, but it still persists, and for me, Scattered Hegemonies conceptualize the transnational in ways that challenge Eurocentric and colonialist perspectives and suggest the need instead to explore various players and relations across different contexts. Their conceptualization of transnational sets out to, quote, problematize a purely locational politics of global, local, or center periphery in favor of the lines cutting across them. As feminists who note the absence of gender issues in all of these world system theories, we have no choice but to challenge what we see as inadequate and inaccurate binary divisions, end quote. Their work insists on the possibilities of reading and drawing relations of power across disparate sites rather than seeking to fit them into a rationalized world system or order. By invoking the outskirts as an organizing principle of the study, I do not mean to fetishize or exoticize the peripheries or margins, or to prioritize relations of space over time. Rather, I critique the tendency of global media research to privilege formalized national frameworks, and corporate brands, international flows, capital concentrations, and unidirectional models of technological innovation and diffusion, and in the process to exclude most of the world's people. While it is essential to track those in power and try to understand their strategies and impacts, researchers often ignore most people's everyday experiences with media technologies. Given this, my approach is in dialogue with recent work such as Jenna Burrell's work on so-called invisible users, Ramon Lobato's and Julian Thomas's work on informal media economies, as well as research on race, class, and/or gender and technology by scholars such as Ruha Benjamin and Clapperton Muhanga, as well as a number of other people. Yet the designation of mediated domains or practices as visible or invisible, formal or informal, tends to diminish the value of people's labor and creativities from the get-go by casting them within an economic or industrial model, when in fact their contributions may assume different dimensions, whether epistemological, sociocultural, educational, or ecological. Building on research on informal media, there's a need to expand the critical awareness of and vocabulary for the uneven material conditions, varied sociotechnical relations, and diverse epistemologies that shape people's knowledges and experiences of media technologies. People's media experiences, I argue, cannot be reduced to these national systems or media capitals or area studies approaches. They demand more situated, phenomenological, and conceptual approaches that recognize everyday social struggles, agencies, and creativities, which are vital to understandings of media globalization, the processes and practices by which media materialize in different sites around the world. Far from being mere endpoints, terminals, or last-mile solutions, technologies of media distribution are embedded in local epistemologies and practices of everyday life. And rather than embrace Western philosophical understandings of media and technology that are often built upon universalizing assumptions, I understand media technologies as sociotechnical relations and situated knowledges that are contingent upon the dynamic, diverse, and differential material conditions in the world. Media technologies, in other words, are not simply tools that showcase varying degrees of human virtuosity, ingenuity, or industrial advancement. They are not metrics or indices of human capacity, progress, development, or efficiency. Rather, media technologies take shape within specific territorial and cultural contexts and become part of particular individuals and communities' attempts to process, participate in, and interpret the complex planetary conditions in which we live. While there's an exciting turn in the field to broaden the conceptualization of media and mediation to include geologies, oceanic fluidities, air, atmospheres, temperature, and other elements. In this book, I approach media for the most part as electronic or digital audiovisual content and its distribution systems. So I'm skipping around a lot in this introduction, so I hope you'll bear with me with the flow here. But my goal in the book is to offer insights based on research across disparate sites that enables unlearning of dominant assumptions that are lodged in the term global media or media globalization. So the outskirts can be thought of as a scattering of sites and socio-technical relations brought together for critical analysis. The selection of these sites has been guided by a feminist politics of positionality and partiality. The book's case studies took shape largely through professional and personal relationships across multiple sites, in person and online, for over a decade. Research on one topic in one site or with one collaborator often generated questions, encounters, or opportunities that led to another. Rather than dismiss these research paths as too personal, happenstance, or nonsensical, I embrace this idiosyncratic process as a critical practice or a method of discovery. And this study is thus also an experiment in method, how to study globalization and media infrastructure in ways that are attuned to the durational, multi-sided, and interventionist potentials of media research and media researchers. Case studies emerge on the outskirts as gatherings, threaded themes, and layers, as research conducted in a splintering of directions rather than on a linear path. And because of this, what follows in the book is really much more of a mediated pluriverse, building on Arturo Escobar's evocative term, as it's more like a mediated pluriverse as much as it is a rendering of media globalization. So there's a section in the intro called Energizing Media that I'll go into now. When thinking about the term media globalization, it's important to recognize the variable material circumstances in which media consumers live. Most people in the world do not have access to ubiquitous broadband internet or grid power. These conditions must inform how scholars think about media globalization. It seems like a really obvious and basic point to say that, but I can't believe how few people recognize that most people in the world who are media consumers do not have electrical outlets in their houses. The majority of media consumers in the world do not have outlets at home to plug their phones in or their devices. It's just really important to know that, know what we're talking about as kind of the baseline conditions. So historically, those in rural communities have relied on the wealth generated by local agricultural cooperatives to subsidize local media and link to national and global systems. In communities in southern and eastern Africa, for instance, costs of media access, consumption, and participation are often contingent upon the sale of crops such as corn, soybeans, and sunflowers. Because of this, agricultural and other resources remain integral to the study of media globalization. State and commercial providers often fail to extend media infrastructure and services to remote areas with smaller population densities, since it's deemed not to be politically or economically profitable. In these contexts, agricultural economies and co-ops serve as the support structures of media technologies. This is a community that I worked in Macha, Zambia, that doesn't have, Zambia is a pretty rich country with regard to electrical resources. It has enormous hydropower resources, but it sells it abroad to neighboring and adjacent countries throughout the region. And so most of its citizens, especially in rural areas, just are not set up even to do basic electrification of lights for kids to read their homework at night. They still use flashlights, which use really bad lead batteries, or they'll use candles, which light up the place for a while, but often not long enough to get the work done for the students to read. So there are all kinds of cascading issues, material conditions and issues that often don't get thought through with regard to our global mediascapes that I'm trying to bring out in this book. And I also think it's important to think relationally across sectors, that media is not in its own entity over in a kind of, isolated silo. It's literally contingent on the sale of these crops. And so we really need relational understandings across different kinds of sectors of the economy and technologies that are intercoordinated to be able to make media accessible and possible in particular sites. So at the same time that these conditions of energy scarcity exist, big tech companies make constant promises regarding their efforts to provide global connectivity in so-called global south and developing contexts. So not only have Facebook and WhatsApp become primary media infrastructures in much of the world, they've kind of made the state telecom providers obsolete, because most people in Brazil, for example, use WhatsApp rather than the state subsidized telecom. Owners of a new asynchronous satellite constellations such as SpaceX and OneWeb have tried to pick up where state and private terrestrial providers have left off, targeting rural low-income communities and promising to, quote, serve the underserved, or the so-called, what they call the so-called bottom billion, who lack internet connectivity. And thus far, the underserved users of these new satellite constellations have mostly been wealthy yacht owners who are underway at sea and in need of broadband to watch movies on Netflix or zoom into a stock meeting. So the services are not being used to actually support people in rural communities as much as we would hope. So just because corporations celebrate technologies of global connectivity and promotions obviously does not mean that it actually occurs. And the question is, how do we critique entities and structures of power and domination in processes of media globalization while also holding on to the power to imagine and recreate these technologies and everyday relations that in the mediascape. A key factor that prevents universal service provision is the dependence of modern media upon electricity. To participate in media culture, most people in the world cannot simply plug their device into the wall, as I said. They must constantly think about how and where to get an electrical charge and plan for this in their daily life, so there's extra labor involved as well. Thus, there's added labor and time involved in their efforts to consume, produce, or share media. These conditions have resulted in local informal economies of cheap energy-related equipment, including solar panels, batteries, power banks, adapters, and cables, which people use to build systems to charge their devices, receive signals or data, and consume and share media. Some of these energy practices seem almost inconceivable to many consumers and scholars in post-industrial Western contexts who enjoy steady flows of grid power and high-speed network services. Those who live in conditions of energy surplus, I would argue, have much to learn from those who contend daily with energy scarcity, for these consumers have a much stronger sense of constraints, limits, and priorities. Given concerns about the global climate crisis, it is not viable or conscionable to continue operating and using media infrastructures and devices guided by mindsets and practices of energy surplus. And Anne Pasek has been doing crucial work on these topics. I've read the piece about the data centers in the Culture Machine special issue, and it's just a fantastic piece. And I know your lab is focusing on these issues specifically, and I can't wait to see what you all do. Each text message, phone call, Google search, social media post, streamed HD movie, or Twitch session requires energy and therefore contributes in some way to climate disruption. Should we move toward device use standards that are not just geared toward limiting screen time for public health purposes, but toward reducing energy and environmental impacts coming from our media devices and sector? The emergent field of environmental media studies is beginning to address these questions, but there's also a need to recognize people around the world who have, by necessity, adopted sustainable practices long before it registered as a critical concern in Western academic contexts. Scholarship that sets out to de-Westernize or decolonize media studies does not always idly assume everyone in the world needs network connectivity to thrive politically, economically, and culturally. Rather, such research carefully considers the socio-historical conditions and agencies and the desires, the interests of diverse peoples. And while it's vital for media globalization researchers to investigate and analyze global media conglomerates or big tech companies, we cannot become intellectually beholden to or overly enraptured by these companies and their operations alone. Echoing Donna Haraway, it matters where we conduct our research, what we choose to focus on or not, which material conditions we explore, and what conceptual frameworks we rely on, as they will shape and inform scholarly understandings of media globalization and other topics. Moreover, there are trade-offs in the ways that research on media globalization can emerge and take shape. For instance, engaging with one national or local context over a long period of time may generate deeper or more nuanced cultural understandings. Conducting research transnationally in and across different locales may build limited yet more relational knowledge formations. Both approaches can aid in grasping the complex dynamics and materialities of media globalization and infrastructure. The study of media globalization values, this particular study of media globalization values the particular over the universal and the idiosyncratic over the systematic. It represents a shift away from state systems and corporate brands, as I said already, and towards situated studies of sociotechnical relations in different contexts. And the goal is not to explore how powerful Western forces of globalization are localized and hybridized or glocalized, but rather to listen and learn from creators, inventors, and users of media technologies on the outskirts and offer critical insights, concepts, and modes of understanding from these particular people and locations. So this is just a shot, a picture of media phone repair worker. The gentleman on the right is known as the preacher, and he knows like the insides and outs of every single phone in the global consumer market that ends up in Dar es Salaam at this major marketplace. And he basically, there's a whole area of this marketplace where people, instead of replacing their phones and upgrading all the time, constantly recirculate. And they know all of the electronics of these phones, how to take them apart, how to remake them, how to jerry-rig alternate parts if they can't find them anymore. They know the phones so well that I was doing some field work and interviews, and some gentlemen came up to me and they said, "Hey, we need to take you into this other building and show you something." And I got a little bit nervous because I was by myself and I had a colleague, but he had to go to a work meeting, and I just said, okay, I'm gonna go with this. And went through all these like dark rooms and tunnels and ended up in this very high-end fabrication lab that they had created to design. The Mobile Phone Repair Workers Union had banded together and designed the first Tanzanian designed mobile phone. And they said they needed at least $25,000 for this phone to actually be manufactured, and that they were in dialogue with Foxconn to make this phone. But I say this because I think how it connects to this project is just the witnessing of the taking apart and reassembling, and all the knowledge and tactile labor and collective labor that went into this led to a different kind of formation than we often see in North America. There are probably certain neighborhoods in the United States where people do a lot more circulation and reuse of their electronics, but we are socialized as consumers to throw them away and to think of them as useless. And I think this is one of my case studies in the book, and I'm not going to go into great depth of it here, but I have a whole section about these issues. So I have maybe, how am I doing on time?
Doing great.
Okay. All right. I'm going to shift to talk a little bit more specifically about research on media infrastructures and how I came into this work. So media infrastructures is a term I have adopted to conceptualize relations across these disparate contexts that I'm trying to get at in this book. And I first began thinking about infrastructure as an object of study. I mean, I'm a media scholar. I was trained to do textual analysis and content analysis, but I also was always really interested in science and technology studies and feminism. So my career is really like trying to find ways to bring these paradigms together in different sites of study. But I first began thinking about infrastructure as an object of study when I was finishing my first book, Cultures in Orbit, which explored how satellite technologies of live international transmission, direct broadcasting, remote sensing and astronomical observation shaped processes and epistemologies of globalization and the televisual. And when conducting research for that book, I visited Earth stations and technical facilities. And those experiences led me to recognize the value of trying to understand small parts of a massive distributed system. Much media studies scholarship at that time, including my own, was influenced by cultural studies. And a lot of that work focused much more on media production and consumption, and not so much on distribution. So when I was studying satellites, I became interested in thinking about infrastructure as a kind of conceptual test bed for new critical and cultural theories of media distribution. So I worked in some shots today from your town because I was walking around today and I just was mesmerized by a lot of the stuff around here. I don't know if you can recognize some of these shots from Peterborough, but this is quite an infrastructure-rich walking tour that I had today. And whether or not to think of any of these as media infrastructure would be a really great conversation. Maybe we could continue in the morning. Some people would say a bridge is a media infrastructure. It brings material entities together. It facilitates exchange. It can be used in trafficking and semiotic exchange as well. Darren Barney, who's a really brilliant media scholar at McGill, has a whole wonderful piece about grain silos as communication technologies. Historically, agricultural communities have used the grain silo as a space that they encircle and exchange news and information about what's going on in the town. So he developed a kind of relational model for thinking about the grain silo and media and communication. So, building on, so as a scholar trained to critique, I was a media scholar that was really trained to critique visual culture. And so I first approached infrastructure as a problem of visual representation. A national or international infrastructure could be approximated in a network map or a flow diagram, but the entire system could not be perceived by one human on the ground or captured photographically because of its extensive scale, unless you might have caught a large stretch of it by satellite above or by an aircraft above. So the particularities of infrastructural equipment, variable nodal conditions, and human operators and users were typically invisible in network cartography. Beyond this, infrastructures are generally considered to be kind of culturally invisible, unintelligible, uninteresting, or even boring, as Susan Lee Starr has famously said. And publics are socialized not to notice, to learn about, or control the layers or stack of infrastructures that define modern societies. Building on the history of telecommunications, science and technology studies, and anthropology, my former doctoral student, Nicole Staroselsky, and I defined the term media infrastructures in our co-edited collection, Signal Traffic, as this is a long definition, situated sociotechnical systems that are designed and configured to support the distribution of audiovisual content. Media infrastructures are both concentrated in particular locations and spread across vast distances. They are highly automated, relying on sensors and remote control, and require human labor for their design, installation, maintenance, and operation. They're material forms as well as discursive constructions, and they're owned by public entities and private companies, are the products of design schemes, regulatory policies, collective imaginaries, and repetitive use. They're also dependent on lands, raw materials, and their dependence on lands, raw materials, and energy imbricates them within issues of finance, urban planning, and natural resource development. So in defining media infrastructures in this way, we hope to mark a shift in the critical orientation of media studies toward issues of distribution and to encourage more experimental and field-based research practices. With the emergence of the internet, mobile telephony, and social media platforms over the past 20 years, there are more media infrastructures to research than ever before, as well as divergent synergistic relations between and across them. The rapid emergence of so many media-related systems at once arguably has compelled a fixation on infrastructure and media studies, at least in certain domains of it. And the current focus on infrastructures and platforms, I argue, is symptomatic of scholarly attempts to grapple with the complex materialities of multiple emergent systems in the midst of their rapid rollout, regulation or lack thereof, and adoption. In some ways, the cycle of media infrastructure research returns to questions addressed in political economic critiques of international and national media systems that emerged in the 60s and 70s. But it also engages with emergent critical paradigms involving objects, new materialisms and ecology, and epistemology or conceptual experimentation. Concomitant with global transformations in the telecom and media sectors has been a renewed focus on object studies and materialism within the humanities and social sciences. While anthropologists have theorized and examined practices of material culture, and feminist and critical race theorists have complicated the status of objects, a burst of influential research on actor networks, object-oriented ontologies, and new materialisms has been very fruitful in this area of media infrastructure research. This theoretically oriented scholarship has helped to inspire and anchor interdisciplinary investigations of infrastructure, drawing upon phenomenology, affect theory, actor network theory, and object studies. Scholars have set out to explore networked materialities and processes of digitization in innovative ways, including by thinking about their contingency upon natural resources and extractive industries, global supply chains and logistics, and environmental conditions. Suffice it to say, there are now so many scholars writing about infrastructures and platforms in provocative and helpful ways that John Durham Peters has referred to this work as, quote, infrastructuralism. He said it's, quote, a fascination for the basic, the boring, the mundane, and all the mischievous work done behind the scenes, a doctrine of environments and small differences, of things not understood that stand under our worlds, end quote. The fields of anthropology, science and technology studies, and information sciences, as well as communication studies, also have their own rich literatures on infrastructure, with frequently cited scholars including Susan Lee Starr, Jeff Bowker, Paul Edwards, Brian Larkin, and Keller Easterling, among many others. As a scholar influenced by feminist STS research, I remain more interested in embodied, proximate, phenomenological investigations of infrastructure than in accounts grounded in continental philosophy. In this way, my research aligns with scholars who engage with people who are users or non-users, technologies, and power in specific contexts. And my goal as a researcher has been to observe and engage with people, artifacts, and sites to formulate a public or populist approach to infrastructure studies, and to populate the category of infrastructure with difference and heterogeneity rather than embrace universal or abstract accounts of what an infrastructure is and how it functions. This has involved using site-specific investigations, transcultural engagements, and critical conceptualizations to try and open up a space for imagining how diverse material conditions may inflect the term media infrastructure in different ways rather than fix it. New materialisms research encourages us to attend to the agential potentials of different objects and to the dynamisms of materialities. Building awareness of these issues and conceptualizations of infrastructure is crucial, as it continuously complicates the tendency toward abstract and static mappings and reminds us that each moment the map is complete, the material conditions have already changed. Given this, conceptualizations of infrastructure require a more agile model, one that posits publics, subconcepts, and dynamisms as integral to their understanding. Infrastructures are often imagined as public utilities, yet often operate beyond public consciousness, involvement, or knowledge. The general lack of public engagement in infrastructures creates the potential to transform public utilities into what I call utility publics, creating conditions in which people organize their daily activities and expend their energy and attention to keep government and or privately owned infrastructures running, but do little to define or advance the relation of these systems to public interests. What does it mean to have human users giving up their time and labor and attention each day, a process Tiziana Terranova refers to as free labor, to capacitate and sustain infrastructures? In the age of the internet, emergent networks that were initially imagined as serving and democratizing the people now appropriate and rely upon those same people's labor, attention, and data to operationalize what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, generating gigantic profits in the process. Public utilities are disappearing more and more, and utility publics, that is, exploited users of the internet and social media, are coveted by big tech companies everywhere on Earth. It is often assumed, based on network cartographies, that infrastructure nodes and facilities and processes have the full authority and permission of local publics to be installed and to perform their operations, but this is not always true. Indeed, there is a need for further research on the localized materialities of media infrastructures and what I've called elsewhere contrapuntal nodes, transmission facilities, earth stations, or data centers that have been built and operated illicitly or against people's will and interests. And that is a historical problem that, of course, goes back to the colonial period, but it's something that we need to talk much more about in this area of research in our field, and we need a lot more research to be able to make these arguments. The goal of contemporary media distributors, after all, is to get publics to connect to the internet and social media platforms and engage in transactions that produce data that can be monetized to support the profits and power of big tech. At least this is how it works in my country, the United States. Not for publics, so that's what the logic is. It's not for publics to have knowledge and opportunities to evaluate the networks installed and operated in their midst. Regulators are supposed to do that work. Remember them? How much public transparency, involvement, and knowledge has there been historically with regard to the construction and operation of the infrastructures that enable media to circulate? Okay, I have like one more section that's mostly a little bit more on methods. So in efforts to, let me see if I'm behind on my slides. Oh, here, this is a site. I wrote a piece about a Mercury satellite Earth station in Zanzibar, off the coast of Tanzania, that was built without the permission of the local people in Zanzibar. And it's a long story, but there's a piece that I've written about it, where the people on the precipice of the revolution in Tanzania, revolution for independence from Great Britain, they kicked these people off the island. They kicked all the American contractors and people working with NASA off the island and took the Earth station down. And I just think it's really important for us to open this up and do a lot more research about how this has happened historically as a way of mobilizing political interventions in the current moment, when many people feel so powerless and overtaken by the omnipresence and wealth of big tech companies that are operating around the world, sometimes in partnership with states, and sometimes just doing it even without consulting. There's a lot more stories to be told about these things. So, in efforts to delve into the issues that I've discussed, I've been experimenting with research on media infrastructures for nearly 2 decades. It's been a long time. And this book is really about this ongoing process of experimentation and what I've learned. And the research has involved using network maps, fieldwork, interviews, drawings, photography, to explore material conditions around particular facilities, installations, or nodes. And these sites include earth stations, cell towers, broadcast transmitters, data centers, and also facilities where there are sociotechnical relations that are related to the infrastructures. So when I'm at these sites, I ask very basic questions, even if answering them is not always straightforward. What is it? Who owns it? How long has it been there? What was here before? Who owns the land? What kinds of materials and equipment are here? How did they get here? Who brought them? How long did it take to build the site? Who does it serve? What is it connected to? Who operates, maintains, repairs, and secures it? How is it related to other systems of energy, water, and transportation? This approach emerged out of the recognition that I was socialized not to know about the infrastructures which I and other people around the world use daily and subsidize. Studying infrastructure then, for me, became about studying what I was socialized not to know and trying to find a language for making sense of it. In my work as a media scholar, I've tried to adopt what I call an infrastructural disposition and engage with infrastructural materialities and outskirts not as givens, but as sites of opacity, difference, relationality, and power that demand investigation, specification, and analysis. And I sought to create research approaches that were more vernacular, ad hoc, and experimental. These approaches involve learning through my own phenomenological engagements, embracing feelings of strangeness and incomprehension, learning from people who live in the vicinity of infrastructural and media objects, and collaborating, a lot of collaborating with users, scholars, and artists, and local partners and leaders in different cultural contexts. And based on this empirical research, I've been trying to formulate ideas about what media infrastructure is, how it takes shape and becomes meaningful across diverse contexts. And findings have led me to question the accuracy of network maps, face the complex biospheres and geopolitics that infrastructures are entangled with, and register the various kinds of informal labor required to sustain vast layered systems. What I've really found is that infrastructure is only boring if we idly accept or normalize static ways of mapping, perceiving, or understanding it. So I think I will end there. Do I have more time? I kind of lost track of time, but
it's about 45 minutes.
Okay, 45 minutes. I'll just flip through quickly some slides. One of the things that I end up trying to do is suggest that we need different media infrastructure typologies, building on work from Raymond Williams, really, and thinking about, and not just saying we have a satellite system or a internet infrastructure. I'm trying to look at particular different milieus and material conditions to say that there's something like Gera district internet in Mongolia. On the outskirts of the center of the city, there are what they call Gera burbs, which are these tent societies that have been built up, and the internet is physically set up there in a very different way than it is by the state providing it to users in other parts of the country. And so I think we need like names and concepts, typological concept, different types of infrastructure that we need to name. Similarly, in Southern California, mobile radio is set up for particular farm workers in Oxnard, California, for example, for Zapotec and Mixtec indigenous people who come from Oaxaca, Mexico, and they work the strawberry fields in Oxnard. They do not speak English and they do not speak Spanish, so they fought very hard to have their own radio station. And the spatial and temporal dynamics of that radio station are set up specifically in relation to the cultural context of their community. And so it's not enough for me as a media scholar to just say, oh, it's a radio station. I want to talk about what a migrant farm worker radio station looks like and how people fight to get it and sustain it and subsidize and pay for it over time. So what I'm trying to get at overall in the book is putting forth different conceptual typologies of different systems that I have tried to learn about and study, so that we can proliferate within this category rather than get in debates about ontology. And so these are some of the, this is part of the system, and I don't want to go into great depth right now, but I'm just showing you some of the scenes, and we did a lot of interviews with people in these sites as well. And beyond that, you know, the internet access in rural Zambia, one of the things that when I was there, and a lot of my own discovery comes through phenomenological findings. When I'm in a place, I'm really trying to take in what I'm observing and think relationally. And I was noticing that the division of labor in the community meant that a lot of women were constantly getting water for their families and having to walk long distances and carry it in buckets. And I was there to study the internet and how internet services got there. But I made like a very basic point and observation that there couldn't even be internet in that area without the water infrastructure, because you need water to survive in this area. And so I sort of recognized that the gendered division of labor, the water carriers were like sub-infrastructure of the internet, because kids at school wouldn't have been able to use the computers or the internet if their mothers hadn't gone out and gotten them water to keep their families alive. And so really trying to understand the kind of cascading materialities of our media systems, that it's not just about data and signals and hardware and electronics, but it's always situated and contingent upon other already existing systems. And I think this is important because it also puts our field in dialogue more explicitly with other disciplines. And we're not just reading in our own field, but we're actually having conversations in environmental studies, you know, or information sciences. When I did this project, I took 6 grad students with me, and most of them were in computer science. So they were also having to learn about what it meant for humanists to be thinking about the technologies that they were trying to test out in dialogue with the people in the community. There are a lot of stories to tell, but I will end it there, and thank you for listening.
So my first part of my question will implicate the second part of the question. Are you familiar with virtual reality and like VR headsets and devices?
Yes.
Okay. So that's my research into virtual reality. And so how do you feel it comes about, because it's such an emerging technology and media infrastructure, how does it tie into like the globalization of media and the possibilities of it being very, very corporate, if you look at the metaverse, but also very, very independent, where you look at a group of like 1 or 2 people making a game essentially just for themselves?
It's a really interesting question. You know, in the communities that I've worked in, at least in Tanzania and Zambia, in that context, there definitely is a gaming culture. A lot of people play games on their phone, but I have not witnessed a fully unfurled virtual reality culture in these contexts. They need to have, in order for them to work efficiently, they really do have to have like constant access to energy and electricity. So frequent disruptions or disconnections would cause a problem for that experience. I think the question is, you know, is there a way in which those systems are being designed and scaled for different kinds of material circumstances? And will that happen over time in the future? The other thing is, with, you know, experiences like the metaverse, there are probably, I have not researched this, so I'm not sure, you may know more about this than I do, but I imagine that some people from developing parts of the world, if they have internet access and high-speed connections, would be interested in checking that out and participating. But that's a research area that is probably evolving and emerging, given how relatively new that system is. I don't know, do you have follow-ups, or do you want to say anything further?
Yeah, I thought of it was how VR can act as a method for media dissemination, but also interaction, because you're able to directly interact with a lot of media that you're playing or experiencing in VR. And it being a way of subverting while also building upon a lot of these concepts of globalization of media, because you, as I mentioned, but like metaverse versus independent, it is both of those at the same time. And I think it's really interesting, and obviously it's very inaccessible right now, so it's hard to figure out how it may become more accessible, and if it does, where will that lead us?
Yeah. It would be fascinating if you could. Are you a designer too?
Yeah.
Well, I would love it if you would design some VR that educates us more about the infrastructures we use every day. You know, we could glide through the network infrastructure. It would be a little bit of a trip because the speed of transit in these systems is imperceptible to a human, right? Like the signal goes so fast that we wouldn't be able to perceive it with at least the existing senses and faculties of our bodies. So I think it would be a great challenge for a designer. Could you design a VR experience that actually meaningfully educates people about the infrastructures they use every day and are completely dependent on for their labor, for their finances, for their dating? We know we see what's at the screen, most of us, and we know very little about the location, ownership, existence of the rest of the system behind that screen. So if you do that, please let me know, and I will be your first test user.
Well, thank you so much for the answer. Really appreciated the talk as a whole as well.
Thanks.
Yes. Hi there. So way back in my former life as an archaeologist, I was in rural South Africa and doing a dig and had a kind of like a superficial experience of the infrastructure there. And one of the issues they talked about a lot was theft of parts. So it was really hard to maintain any kind of infrastructure because wires were taken and so on and so forth. And I was thinking about how valuable a solar panel might be. So I'm wondering how that was dealt with in some of the areas where you worked.
Yeah, thanks for that question. You're exactly right that a lot of the heavy metals that are used in the cables and even in the built insulation casings and facilities are of value in a salvage economy. When I was working in Macha, Zambia, I noticed a man sitting in a kind of security guard. He was a security guard in a tower that was about this big, made out of metal. Remember, this is a very hot climate, so he's sitting in a metal container for 12-hour shifts and sitting there to watch Mobicom's facility, cell phone tower right there, and make sure that nobody came to intercept or steal parts. And so there's a relationship then between media infrastructure and the security economy, security worker economy, to monitor and maintain the facility and make sure that it's secured. And, it also had gates and fences around it and everything, but they needed a physical guard there. So it's quite common, and not only in Zambia. I actually wrote a piece about this issue. It was, I think the piece is called Satellites. I'll have to dig up the title, but I wrote it maybe 10 years ago about the theft of metals out of infrastructure in Eastern and Southern Africa. So thanks for asking that. It kind of goes back to the first question of what does it mean to be an affluent media user, and what does it mean to live in conditions of poverty and actually be willing to cut open a system to pay for food for the family. We have this broad spectrum of media consumers in the world, and we often don't imagine how the kind of impetus and attraction of media use in a energy scarce and developing context. And a lot of people will do quite a lot to get access to a phone, to keep it going, to charge it. I interviewed women who were involved with men who said, my husband, you know, they lived on a relatively limited income. My husband wastes our money by buying 5 phones. He doesn't need these. But in their local village community, it became a sign of status, and he felt he needed to do that. So there are all kinds of local economies that need to be investigated and thought about, rather than just relegated to the field of maybe anthropology or economics. I feel like as media scholars, we need to be aware of these issues. So thanks.
Just to follow up from that, actually. So if you're in a position of this scarcity of the resource, so they have to work this hard to get the funds, what do they then do with them? I mean, we do everything because we're so we've got all this availability. So I feel like I do everything: banking and reading and research. I mean, what do they do with it with that limited amount? What becomes most important?
I mean, I think it would be really interesting to do a study where people allow you to monitor their mobile phone use over a certain amount of time to see the extreme variety.
But do they tell you?
There's a lot. Yeah, they use it for social media.
Right.
Like most of their news consumption is, when I was interviewing them, was on Facebook. You know, and so they use it for news consumption. They post. They learn about the elections through their social media. There's a lot of engagement with that. There's hardly any use of email.
Right.
Very limited use of word processing software and PDF. Like those type of doc and PDF were not. A lot of people weren't even using desktops and laptops in areas that I was in, but the mobile phone is their be-all device. Kids would be gaming. There was a lot of music listening. A lot of just using it as a loudspeaker. Mobile phone is used collectively by people, collective to collective conversation instead of point to point, individual. You would go to the market and see a whole family of about 6 people around one phone talking to about 6 people on the other end. So just fundamentally different kinds of formations and uses, kind of heterogeneity of mediated conditions rather than the models that we have tended to settle on, at least in our field of media and communication studies. We don't have the typological statements of what the actual use of the technologies are, and that's what I'm trying to excavate and bring forth in dialogue and in collaboration with many people.
What a wonderful talk. I'm enjoying this, and I wanted to preface this question with an apology. I'm a print culture historian of the 18th century, so please, excuse anything that might come after this. But I think you hit it at it, and this is what really fascinated me, is that in the 18th century, as you know, newspapers were made for individuals, but of course somebody could read it over somebody's shoulder. Yeah. And more importantly, people went to these nodal points, these foras of exchange, coffee houses, physical fora, coffee houses, clubs, theaters, where then a further diffusion of the media could happen.
Yeah.
And what really fascinated me about your talk, this idea of these regions where infrastructure, for a better word, is weak or insecure. Do you see a return to the 18th century in the sense that you have technology which is designed for individual use to imbibe media is now actually being used communally? And are the points where infrastructure is available, i.e. the satellite points, is that becoming like the coffee house or the theater of 21st century Zambia? Because those are the points where people can connect and then talk about what they're connecting about.
It's a great question, and I do think it's important for me to also flag as part of the study that it's very 21st century. And I'm glad you brought up print culture and a whole history of media, history and archaeology that goes back centuries. So I'm aware of that, and I think it's really important that media students and scholars know that. But I don't see a lot of extensive use of print culture in the areas that I've been working, I see extensive use of radio and sound technology. Way more radio and sound than I see in my everyday life in the US. Radio is a lot more important in national and local politics in certain African countries. And people have gotten their hands on radio apparatus, and then radio is also distributed through mobile phones, and so there's a lot of that. But I'm not seeing, in fact, this is a longer point here, but because of authoritarianism in some of these countries, because of political transitions that don't support free speech, free expression, if anything, there has been a repression against a lot of the press. And there have been people killed in recent years. If you want to learn more about this, the Committee to Protect Journalists has an Africa office, and they do a lot of tracking. And when I was doing some research, I had to be in touch with them about some people actually being endangered. So the print and kind of literate cultures, there's just I'm not an expert in that area and the areas I've been working, but I didn't see a lot of evidence in it. There aren't even photocopiers, like in a lot of these areas where they would photocopy and share documents. And I think most things are being done through the mobile phone. And the most important things that I noticed were, at the time, I haven't been back since 2019 because of the pandemic, so they were still really using Facebook and a lot of sound technology.
I appreciate it, thank you. And I guess just as a quick follow-up,
Yeah.
Are they using those mobile technologies like print though? Like, are they discussing them into a wider
I see,
or
yeah.
are they
In
doing
the
just their
ethos.
individual texting on it?
I would say it's hard for me to associate that with the history of print culture, because from what I've read about the national histories and local histories, the secondary reading I've done for this research would suggest that it comes out of oral culture and traditions in village communities, in rural areas of the country. That it's about the use of local language and speaking together and being together, rather than a kind of structure of individuation and mobile privatization, which we tend to see with the electronic media systems.
That makes total sense. Thank you
Yeah.
very much.